Gary, you've done a lot of peacemaking work in Ireland, and you served as a pastor. Tell us about kind of where you're from and what got you into peacemaking work.
Okay, yeah. I often, Caleb, try to contextualize my life just by telling a story, because the person who's most important in our life, Jesus, was a brilliant storyteller. I'm nowhere near where he is, but I often highlight the story as a kid, kind of growing up, late 60s, early 70s in Belfast. I tell the story of three young boys, just ordinary kids. Listen, they could have lived in Phoenix, Arizona, San Diego, Atlanta, anywhere. Two of those kids went to what we would call religious Sunday school together in our context. Another two went to primary school together, age 4 to age 11 in our context. One of those boys is now dead. He was shot in the back during an internal terrorist feud in the 80s. The other boy served a life sentence of 18 years, again being involved in political violence or terrorism, slit someone ear to ear, dumped their body in a back alley. And I'm the third boy that ends up a Methodist pastor. I always tell that story not to kind of say, oh, lucky Gary, but just to say that a number of people in our space got involved in political violence or terrorism for what I would describe really, Caleb, as toxic theology or toxic politics. So as a colleague of mine actually said, in the late 1960s, someone did not fly over Northern Ireland, spray us all with lunatic gas, and we all woke up one morning and said, let's start killing each other. There's a context there for centuries of what I call toxic theology and toxic politics. Now, what my two schoolboy friends did was wrong, fundamentally. I'm not kind of justifying terrorism, but I think it's too simplistic just to write them off without asking the question, what made 16 and 17-year-old kids, who in today's context, as you and I know, would be like boy soldiers, what made them do this, and what shaped them to dehumanize another group of people who were their neighbors? So I lived through 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, was ordained, came to faith, very strong born-again experience in July 1983, candidated for ministry and was ordained in May 1987. And all that ministry, I guess, Caleb, by choice, was not spent in suburbia, it was spent in the inner city of Belfast. You can analyse that 100 ways. When I tell that story sometimes in the States and people say, oh, he didn't make that choice, immediately the Christian reaction, God has his hand upon you, as if I'm someone special. I often say this, and I say this tongue-in-cheek, is there such a thing as a theology of luck, that I didn't make the choice that my two school friends made? I mean, I don't know. It's one of those things that I just find myself trusting God in the dark around. There's no pat theological answer to why I didn't make that choice. Because honestly, Caleb, these kids were no different than me or you. They enjoyed soccer. They enjoyed going to youth organizations in the church. But when violence broke out, something flipped. They made awful decisions, invariably guided by older, more manipulative individuals, interestingly.
So growing up, early 80s, you're watching some of your friends, classmates choose to give themselves over to what you're calling toxic theology, toxic politics. How are those things weaving together, the theology and the politics that was driving people to violent acts?
I mean, looking back, Caleb, without boring your listeners with 800 years of chaos in this blinking island in which I've lived all my life, there was that kind of God is on our side mentality. There was no question about it. So if you want to look at the two tribes on this island, namely British Unionist Protestants loyalists who give their allegiance to the British, to the United Kingdom, and Catholic Republican Nationalists, Irish, who give their allegiance to Ireland. If you go back 100 years, interestingly, sort of 1912, what you would call in your context a militia group form called the Ulster Volunteer Force. And their motto way back in 1912 was, for God in Ulster. Ulster being the Protestant space in the northeastern part of Ireland. The British were going to disengage from this space because it had enough of us blinking Irish in our conflict, and they rebelled against that. And they ended up signing another biblical word that you and I will know very well. They ended up signing the Ulster Covenant. My grandfather signed that, determined to resist. The phrase of the day was home rule, i.e. rule by the Irish, is Rome rule. So they were very much equating rule by Irish Catholics as being linked. And in the kind of Westminster Confession of Faith, as you and I know from those long days ago in theology school, the Pope was the Antichrist. So all that theology was bubbling about. 1916, long before you and I were on planet Earth, we had the Easter Rising in Dublin, where a small group of Irish nationalists tried to drive the Brits out of Ireland. The theology behind that was, as Christ rose in resurrection victory, we will drive the Brits out of Ireland. So it's that kind of God is on our side mentality. And as I often say, almost saying, is God Irish, British? Perhaps he's American. Maybe some of your American listeners are saying, no, Gary, he's not Irish or British. God's actually American. Maybe he's Palestinian at the moment or Israeli. I mean, I keep saying that my citizenship, my primary citizenship, I carry both a British and an Irish passport. That was part of the fudge of our peace deal. But according to St. Paul, my citizenship is in heaven. So while my American, Irish, or British, or whatever other identity may be important, my eternal identity is not of this world. And I think too many people in this space, Caleb, I mean, as I often say, politics is temporal, the gospel is eternal. And in your space, as I look at it, in my space, as I looked at it through a 30-year internal civil war, I can assure you political identity was much more important to too many people than an eternal identity, sadly.
Yeah. So in just those few examples that you gave, it sounds like there's this mixing or conflation of theological statements, Christ is king, Christ reigns, and then merging that with, and because of that, we're going to do violence. Or because Christ is king, we are going to set up our government this way. What is the fallout of that conflation, of that synthesizing aspects of the Christian tradition with a particular political movement?
I mean, I think even for the outside observer, even a cursory glance at the New Testament, I mean, Jesus also had the option that many Americans have today, many people in my space had today, was let's start a violent revolution. I mean, because of those 12 disciples, I mean, analyzing, I keep reminding people, Simon the Zealot was a first century Jewish terrorist who came to faith in Christ. So he was into the kind of uprising, the arms, let's overthrow the Romans, etc., etc., etc. Yet every time they wanted to do that, Jesus dissuaded them from doing that and using what I would call eternal principles to do so. I suppose a number of us wrestle, Caleb, actually with this because, I mean, in the the late 1980s, after 20 years of political violence or terrorism, a number of us are asking the question, I mean, is theology some like fusty, musty, dusty relic, kind of confined to the rarefied atmosphere of church? Or does theology make a difference in the public space? Because Jesus' ministry was not spent in a synagogue, it was spent in the public square, merely making a profound difference. So in the kind of mid-80s, a number of us from an evangelical tradition, and I always separate the words evangelicalism from the word fundamentalism, because, I mean, evangelical means good news, and in my space, and I would suggest in your space, that a lot of people who call themselves evangelical, I scratch my head and ask, are these people really good news? Because to a lot of people outside the church, they are bad news because of their behavior, the language they use, violence, etc., etc., etc. We put together a booklet there, an organization called Econi, which was simply Evangelical Contribution on Northern Ireland. It's a tiny, tiny booklet. It went on to develop into some serious Bible studies, Caleb, but we simply call it For God and His Glory Alone. So we didn't call it For God in Britain or Ireland or America or Canada, but primarily as a follower of Christ, God's glory should be paramount, and everything else should naturally flow or evolve from that concept.
So Your calls for God's glory alone is in contradistinction to for God's glory and us being in control of the government or whatever it might be. When you watch in Ireland or you're watching now in America, uh, people use the name of Jesus to justify grasping for government power or even use of the sword. Uh, what happens to the witness of the church when that happens?
Personally, I think it actually diminishes. There's no sense I sometimes tease congregations, Caleb, as I'm sure you do as well. And I actually do say, if we really genuinely believed in life after death, that should revolutionize any person's life. And yet I see people clinging on to things that are completely temporal and that are going to completely pass. I mean, I remember doing a TED Theo talk in Atlanta. It was like September 2022. And I remember ending it just with the kind of words where I said, look, when the final kind of eschatological curtain falls on planet Earth, it isn't going to be Joe Biden, Donald Trump, George Bush, Boris Johnson, Angela Merkel, Vladimir Putin, Mao Zedong standing on the stage. There'll be one single person on that stage. It's not going to be Caleb Campbell or Gary Mason. I can guarantee your viewers that today. It's going to be a person called Jesus Christ. And Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, Boris Johnson, Margaret Thatcher will all simply realize they were two-bit actors in a drama produced by another person called Jesus Christ. So I just think sometimes we're holding on, and I'm not of that like nonsense that, that we just kind of glide through this world in a cloud. I mean, I do think the church needs to wrestle with serious social issues. There's no question about that. But because you have Christian values, they should be part of a nation. But people, I think, are using what you and I would call Christian symbolism, terminology, to prop up systems that are not Christian and are actually temporal. I just think that's fundamentally wrong. And I think it does faith a disservice. And it's not as if, Caleb, this is new. I mean, like, look at Jesus, first century, call it Israel, call it Palestine. There's a debate going on about that, as you and I know too well on planet Earth at the moment. Mm-hmm. But Jesus grew up in a space of ethnic religious nationalism.
Yep.
Not dissimilar to me or dissimilar to you. And yet he never took up any arms. In fact, he said to you and me and to your listeners, this kingdom is not of this world. So the issues of land, identity and religion were prevalent in the first century as they are in many, many spaces in the 21st century.
So in America, it's common to view Irish as highly religious people.
Yeah.
In our movies, in our pop culture, usually to be Irish is to be associated with Roman Catholicism. That's a lot of how the American mind has been shaped. As I've talked to more and more actual Irish, I'm hearing that there's actually a movement away from religion because it's been conflated with violence and political power grabs. Is that something you're seeing in Belfast?
Oh, totally. I mean, we're hanging in there, I guess, Caleb. The two, with Ireland and the US, a lot of things in common, but one of the things they still have in common, even though that's slightly going down the Richter scale, is Northern Ireland and the southern states still have the highest church-going populations in the Western world. That's not talking about the two-thirds world in the south as such, but high degrees of church attendance, that is now fading. I mean, and one of the reasons it's fading, particularly in the Republic of Ireland, which is primarily 94, 95%, let's say sociologically Catholic, is because of the child abuse scandals. I mean, that's one of the reasons that people have lost trust in what you and I would define as institutional Christianity. And it is that kind of, concept. I mean, the writer David French, whom you and I would know, does that great article there where he talks about Christendom versus Christianity.
Yeah.
And I mean, we always have to be careful around institutions, because institutions invariably, as you and I know, can end up power grabs by people who have no scruples. It becomes more about the personality. And I don't need to remind you Americans about a number of interesting scandals you've had over the last number of years where people's ego has become so high that aspects about humbling yourself, etc., has slightly fallen down the scale, as you and I know. So, in relation to that, I mean, religion is on the decline. There's no question about that within the Western world. I mean, you look at British Methodism, which obviously I would have an association with there. I mean, John Wesley would have chaired the Irish Methodist Conference for years. And we all know Wesley's theology out in the public space. But British Methodism now is an absolute rapid decline. And I sometimes, I wrestle that question, as I'm sure you do as well. And I just think, how do we do church in the public square? I mean, an old Southern Baptist preacher who would have had an influence on me when I was converted there, Vance Havner, long dead, buried in Greensboro in North Carolina, said teasingly about the American church, but pretty accurately, I think he said, too many American churches are building $1 million salt depositories in street corners when the church is meant to be a salt dispenser. So I think too many churches are hung up on very highly produced religious acts of worship, etc., where it becomes a form of entertainment, where Caleb or Gary get points out of 10 on a Sunday, the worship band, the organist, without realizing. I often describe church, Caleb, it's a spiritual injection in my bicep on a Sunday morning to push me out into the public square, not to leave church feeling good about myself, to be quite honest.
Oh, I love that. So, Gary, you used a phrase a few minutes ago, ethnic religious nationalism. In America, especially since the events of January 6, 2021, the phrase Christian nationalism has been very popular. Some would call it white Christian nationalism or American Christian nationalism. Could you help us understand from your view, what is ethnic religious nationalism?
Okay, so, story that we all know, the story of the Good Samaritan. Interestingly, the word good was never used in the text, but we all know the kind of story. Jesus meets this thinking, highly articulate Jewish lawyer in the first century, and he asks a question: who is my neighbor? It's interesting that Jesus flips that question on his head as he goes through the conversation and ends up turning it to who is being a neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
But all those things of land, identity, and religion, I don't know this first century Jewish lawyer, but I do know this, Caleb, from my perspective. I know what he wanted to hear. Jesus, who is my neighbor? He wanted to hear, oh, your neighbor is like you.
Mm-hmm.
He dresses like you. He worships in the same synagogue church as you. He votes for the same political party as you. Now, I struggle with this parable, as you probably do as well, because I am not a universalist, nor do I believe that once we're dead, we're dead. But Jesus picks a Samaritan. So I one of the conversations I hope to have with Jesus, help me understand why you pick someone who most people then and today was pretty heretical, because they didn't believe in life after death, as an example. And maybe it was just to make us wrestle with some of those questions a little bit more. Because here was a person that he was saying was overlooking those concepts of land, identity, and religion to care for a person. And then as I kind of also look there, Caleb, there's a number of conflicts today, but the one that, is gripping us most is the Middle East, and Ukraine has slightly slipped down your news channels, and I know my news channels here in the UK and Ireland. I mean, as you look at Putin is a brilliant example of Christian nationalism.
Okay.
I mean, Putin wore a cross around his neck, still does, when he strips to the waist there is, showing off that beautiful physique riding horses. His father was an atheist and his mother was a Christian. He was secretly baptized. And in reality, if you look at kind of Putin's thinking, I mean, the Archbishop Creel there described Putin as a miracle from God. I mean, this is a person that's overseeing genocide, rape, child kidnap, and you have some religious actor sitting in Moscow describing this person as a miracle from God. I mean, I just cannot buy into that type of theology. So I think any form of Christian nationalism, I mean, at the end of the day, Caleb, Christianity is about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. People in my space, you can call them Christian nationalists or militia groups, what many of them did quite cleverly was take Christian motifs and use them for nationalistic ends. Typical example, my friends I told you about earlier, how did they enroll in those militia groups or terrorist groups? I remember this. They went up iron-wrought staircases in a room with men dressed in masks. They took a gun in one hand and a Bible in the other and swore allegiance. And I quite simply say, and candidly say, and honestly say, you always need a little bit of toxic religion to justify what you're going to do. And I see that happening in the United States as well. And I think pastors are wrestling with this. I mean, I think there's a lot of fear, Caleb, in the US at the moment. Pastors are frightened. I know a number of churches I preached in recent years, people have said to me, Gary, don't dare mention Trump or Biden or Clinton, and just don't do it.
Yeah,
you want to split my church, fact. So it is.
Oh yes, I've encountered that many times where ministers, church leaders are feeling a great deal of anxiety around divisions in the congregation that are there.
Yeah,
the divisions are there, but we're not going to talk about it, because if we talk about it, they're not trained, they're not equipped, they don't have the muscle to process together their political differences. And even what you were saying, it's more than just a view on policy. It really is an identity. It's an allegiance question. And that's one of the things that's so dangerous about what we're seeing in America and American Christian nationalism is it's not actually about politics. It's about ultimate allegiance and identity. And the politics is just in service of that. And so the answer, what I'm hearing you invite us into is, well, when my ultimate passport is in heaven, when my ultimate allegiance is to Jesus for his glory alone, that gives me the muscle to be able to maintain union with people who are on different political teams, because it's not an identity question. You've leaned into this a lot in peacemaking work, in frankly, a very conflicted people group. We're watching that happen in America. What coaching would you give to us, those of us who are thinking about, how do I create bridges instead of burn bridges with people in my family, my church, my community?
I mean, I'll quote a New York Times journalist, Bret Stephens, who's well enough known, and he uses that phrase there. In other words, to disagree well, you must understand well. I mean, I kind of preach in the States, quite a lot, as you know there, Caleb. And kind of as an outsider, I can definitely get away with things that you probably wouldn't, in a sense. So I remember preaching at church in Tampa last year and teasingly talking about the whole concept of division and loyalty to things that aren't going to last, and saying, so I said, this week, congregation, I'm staying with close friends of mine who are Republicans. Now, I will leave their home in 4 or 5 days and I will stay with my other friends who are Democrats. And I said, here's the shock. They're both relatively normal. Of course, everyone laughs in a sense, but probably for you to say that is much more difficult. And in the same way, we needed outside help. And we have a number of colleagues in the US kind of looked into our space as well. So it is difficult to speak into those spaces. I wrestle with this. I remember during COVID, doing a thing with 150 plus pastors and lay leaders in North Georgia. And then the guy asked me a question. He said, Gary, how do you deal with this? Like, you can't mention personalities. And I'm saying we need to take personalities out of this. I think what we need to do is create what I call a moral or a gospel framework to ask people to choose allegiances. So I did this experiment in a church in Fayetteville. I'll tell this story because your listeners will smile about it. And there's a church maybe midweek, so like 100 people there, not a lot of people. I says, tell me this, in this church tonight, in this auditorium, who had a relative here who fought in the Second World War? So lots of hands go up. I said, well, let me tell you my Second World War story. I said, I had an uncle, my uncle Jimmy, who militarily marched me to church most Sundays as a kid. I said he was rescued at Dunkirk when the Nazis pushed the Allied forces into the sea. So I asked the question, just to keep it more human, tell me who has seen the movie Dunkirk? So obviously lots of hands went up. I says, my uncle Jimmy taught me how to swim as a little boy. I says, interestingly, he went in the second day of D-Day. So I asked the question, tell me, who's seen the movie Saving Private Ryan? So again, Caleb, lots of hands went up across that auditorium. I said, do you remember the last bit of that movie? With this American GI kneels before a headstone on a grave of a colleague of his, a fellow GI, who didn't make it back to the United States. And he turned to his wife and he said something was really, really profound. In fact, it was pretty spiritual. He said to his wife, tell me I've been a good man, as he cried.
Yeah.
And I said, I know every person. I said, the only person I know in this church tonight is the pastor who brought me and the pastor who pastors this church. But I don't know any of you, but I do know this. At the end of my life, I want to hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant. That's the most primary thing I want to hear in my life. I said, I want to talk to you now about something that's difficult, but I think it's important I give you my observations. If you don't agree with me, don't ask me back. No issue. So I said, I want to talk about January the 6th. And I said, tonight, if you're a Republican, I'm not getting at you. Period. I'm not getting at you. And if you're a Republican and a Democrat here tonight, you have a right to peaceful protest. Categorically in democracy, we're allowed to peacefully protest. Can I tell you my difficulty with January the 6th? I had several difficulties, and I hope you'll understand this. I said, there was a guy outside your seat of democracy with a T-shirt that said, Camp Auschwitz. There was another guy with a T-shirt on that said 6MNWE. So I said, they started, so you don't know what that means. Let me tell you what it means. It means 6 million Jews were not enough. Now, all you people here tonight are patriotic. I'm patriotic about my Uncle Jimmy, categorically. He could have lost his life as a guy in his late teens trying to destroy the most evil system that's ever been on planet Earth, and your relatives did exactly the same. I said, I think that actually dishonors your dead. I think for some idiot to be running about with a T-shirt on, calling for another Shoah or Holocaust, dishonors your dead, and that is fundamentally wrong. So I'm not asking you not to be a Republican, I'm not asking you not to be a Democrat, but I'm asking you prophetically to call out things that are wrong, that are dishonoring your patriotic dead. So the service ended, and I kind of sort of smile when I tell this story. Both Republicans and Democrats smile. I was standing at the front of the church, shaking people's hands, greeting me. I saw this guy coming down. I'm not tall, Caleb. I'm 5'7". I weigh 170 pounds. I saw this guy coming down, 6'3", probably weighing 250, 300 pounds. And I internally said, I know this guy is a Republican by the way he's walking as he was coming down to me. But he came down, he put his arms around me, he started crying. And he said in a thick Georgia accent, which I attempt to mimic. Your viewers can say, Gary, that is wicked the way you're doing that accent, but I'll try to mimic. So he kind of says to me, Caleb, Gary, I've been a lifelong Republican all my life, but you are right. That is wrong. And I said, look, Bill, I am not asking you not to be a Republican, categorically. But I'm just asking you this question morally. Should people be outside your Capitol building calling for another Holocaust? And he simply said no. So I just think people need clear blue water between the eternal gospel of Jesus and people aligning themselves with the Republican Party, who have had many friends in. I mean, tomorrow I have 15 Republicans and 15 Democrats arriving with me in Belfast. So I'm not kind of taking sides in this, except for the sense I'm trying to take the side of the eternal gospel, because that's going to last. And I know, Caleb, I hope you and I are decades away from our death, but I do know something about you, just having got to know you, and you know this about me. When I'm lying in my deathbed, on the assumption I don't die quickly, I will not be thinking about Margaret Thatcher or Vladimir Putin or Mao Zedong or Adolf Hitler or Bill Clinton or Donald Trump or George Bush. I will be thinking about what shaped my life in an eternal perspective. And I just say to fellow listeners, I'm not asking you to give up your Republican views or your Democrat views, but could they maybe be superseded by the eternal gospel of Jesus Christ? That's it. Period.
That's so good. So, Gary, thinking about how we live our faith in our this common life together we have in civic engagement, political engagement, I'm hearing you say, tether yourself to your ultimate allegiance, namely Jesus, have eternal perspective, recognize that we're citizens of the kingdom of God before we're citizens of any kingdom of this world. I'm also hearing you qualify that by saying that doesn't mean run away from civic engagement. It doesn't mean go to a monastery and hide from everybody or sequester yourself. So coach us in how our faith can guide us in civic engagement in a way that still bears a faithful witness to the gospel.
Caleb, like you, I've had my critics over the years, and the best way to do that's through stories. I was the youngest of a group of clergy person in the late 1980s that began to engage with people who were pursuing political violence, terrorism, the kind of academic phrases you and I know as non-state actors, very nice little phrase. But these people were killers. And I think some of us had to ask the question, first of all, did Jesus talk to killers? Yeah, most days in life. He engaged Roman centurion, classic example. Jesus, are you talking to a killer who is a member of the most efficient military machine on planet Earth, namely the Roman army, who has the jackboot on the neck of the Jews? Yes, he was. So I'm following his example, not some human example. And I said this, Caleb, in those early days, because I was young. These guys were like 10, 20 years older than me. They were in their like 40s, 50s, 60s, some of them. And I said this, if you lock 40 men in a room, was primarily men, our gender, that kind of macho alpha male agenda. I said, if you lock 40 men in a room listening to their own reassuring voices, it's a recipe for disaster. So how do I create a gospel framework or a moral framework to present what I call attractive alternatives? Because the gospel is attractive. Let's be honest, extremism does not make the gospel attractive. So how was I trying to do an attractive alternative to their lifestyle? Eventually, we spilled into ceasefires in 1994. Eventually, Good Friday Agreement in 1998. But another example, 2001, some people just hadn't moved away from violence. I facilitated, I mean, your viewers want to Google this, they can Google Dr. John Reid, who's in Tony Blair's cabinet, asked, could he do a visit to my church to meet with some of these hardliners? And I brought the hardliners into my church to facilitate this conversation. Now, I got it on the neck from some people for bringing the great unwashed into the holy sanctuary, you know, those kind of stories.
Mm-hmm.
And if you had to judge that day, people would have said I failed. Because in the previous year, there had been something like 200 to 300 pipe bombs, even after the Good Friday Agreement. Over that year after that meeting, there were only 5. So it's what I would say all pastors, we need to take what I call thoughtful, strategic, prophetic risks. Not reckless stupidity, which sometimes I have done as a clergy person. I've done my fair share of mistakes, but thoughtful, strategic, prophetic risks in doing that. In 2009, and again, your viewers can Google this, the Ulster Volunteer Force, that organisation, militia group that I told you about from 1912, as part of the Good Friday Agreement, there were a number of things had to happen. One of them was weapons decommissioning of terrorist groupings. The Ulster Volunteer Force, who were the most lethal terrorist group, political violence, whatever phrase you want to use, on the pro-British side, read their weapons decommissioning statement in my church building. Now, again, some people yapped and moaned about that. But I said, hey, come on. Look at Isaiah. How do you beat swords into plowshares? And I said to these people, would you rather they had done that statement like in a drug den or in a liquor store?
Right.
With masks and symbolism, temporal symbolism behind them, or to do it in a space with the eternal cross of Christ behind you. And that's why I just think we need to be in there, and we need good people around us, Caleb. I know, listen, I'm ordained, Lord, from 1987, it's coming, seems like a lifetime, nearly 40 years now in a sense, and you do need good people, because after that John Reid meeting, interestingly, I got it on the neck from several people. No issue with them giving it to me in the neck. In a church Christian magazine, they criticized me. I actually didn't respond. But other colleagues of mine came in behind me. So I tried to depersonalize and say, actually, Gary, this is not about you.
Yeah.
This is about gospel principles. So let other people put those gospel principles on the table. So it's not me versus the person who wants to get at me. And I just felt, and I probably did this by accident, where other older clergy or believers came to me and said, Gary, just you stand aside. Let us fight this battle. So I say to some pastors, get good, godly people around you. Not necessarily get those who disagree with you to rubber stamp what you're doing, but at least to humanize the debate
Hmm.
and to allow, Caleb's heart's a good heart, Gary's heart's a good heart, Bill's heart's a good heart, Susan's heart's a good heart. Let me tell you, they're not doing this to annoy you. Trust me. They're doing it because this is how they interpret eternal values.
Hmm.
And then they hear their story as well. Why did you choose to do this? Tell me your story. I mean, I know if I was a pastor in the States now, I'd be hanging out with a lot of militia groups saying, tell me your story. What shaped that? Was it a grandparent? Was it a brother? Was it a friend? I'm really interested to hear your story. And and I often say this to churches, Caleb, in the States, how do you use sacred space for storytelling? Because the academic Gospel talks about that storytelling, actually says science has proven that storytelling is the most effective mechanism for changing people's minds. So I say to churches, you need to create once upon a time moments. And they go, why? So I'll tell you why. Remember when you were 5 or 6 years of age, you were sitting in your pajamas. It was 7:30 at night. You're about to go to sleep. Your mom, your dad, your big sister, your aunt, your uncle sat in your bedside. They said 4 magic words, once upon a time, and your eyes lit up. So I would challenge the American church. How do you bring Republicans and Democrats together for once upon a time moments? And what does that look like? It's not up to me to tell people how to do it, but contextually, there's enough Christian wisdom in the States in both Republicans and Democrats to know how to do that.
Yeah, I love that. Gary, that's so good. Well, you are certainly traveling a lot and sharing the good news a lot. Where can people find you and your work if they're wanting to learn more?
Yeah. I mean, if Google the name does help. There's a number of bits and pieces come up, some boring, hopefully not some so boring. Just Google sort of Reverend Dr. Gary Mason Belfast. There's a website there as well, which is dead easy, rethinkingconflict.com. And there's also a Facebook page that just kind of tells. And it may be interesting because, I mean, I'm hosting 15 Republicans and 15 Democrats, all in a religious perspective from tomorrow, namely 11th of May. And I suppose what I'm trying to do is, Caleb, this is what a civil war looks like. And I'm going to have people speaking to them that fought the war who will be saying, guys, if you can resolve this in a different way, because Caleb, honestly, 26 years after signing a Good Friday Agreement, if you were to say to me, Gary, when you're not in the States or you're not in Israel or Palestine, what do you do in that tiny, pokey little island of Ireland? What do? I'm dealing with legacy. I'm dealing with memory. I'm dealing with the past. And I say to American Christians, you don't want this spectre hanging over you if things, God forbid, go badly wrong over the next year, because economically, spiritually, psychologically, theologically, sociologically, you're going to put such a dent in your nation, it's going to take you decades to recover. We're still recovering. So I do say that graciously and prophetically. There's another way to do this. And it's through godly spiritual wisdom, not reactionary words. We'll finish just Jonathan Sacks, the brilliant Jewish theologian who died a few years ago. I had the privilege of meeting Jonathan once in London, not long before he died of cancer. Jonathan Sacks uses this phrase, linguistic violence. And I look at linguistic violence in my space. I look at linguistic violence over Brexit. I look at linguistic violence in the Middle East at the moment. And I look at linguistic violence in the United States. And I think, let me finish with an eternal principle. Jesus reminds Caleb and Gary and all our listeners today. He says, Caleb and Gary, you're going to be judged on your actions, but also on your words. So I would just appeal to Christians, people who are people, genuinely people of faith, be careful how you speak in the public square. Because sometimes our words can be absolutely toxic in relation to that. And I just think we need to be careful.
Yep, I agree. Yeah, we can practice the fruit of the Spirit instead of linguistic violence.
Yeah,
and
totally.
to control our tongue and to control our hearts best as possible when we engage. Yeah. Well, Gary, thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate you and your work and have loved our new friendship. So thank you so much for being on.
And bless you in all you're doing. It's the right thing to do. Okay, bless you, Caleb. All right, take care. Bye-bye.